Hi, Isaac, number two.
Rabbi, good morning. It's so great to see you.
Okay, like I said, one more time, we are trying to finish the fourth story of the healing stories of Matthew, and this one is very special because this is the only one with a biblical prophecy fulfillment. And if anything, maybe we should wonder, how come there aren't more prophecy fulfillments found throughout Matthew? If anything, this prophecy fulfillment talks about healing. It seems Jesus healed before. So one thing I guess we're gonna have to ponder is what is so special about either this fourth story or the arc of these stories that we have this prophecy fulfillment. Why are prophecy fulfillments important? Isaac, do you ever think about like how often if Jesus had let me put it this way, if Jesus had no prophecy fulfillments, he just kind of was, and all the Christians says he's Messiah. Would that be a problem? I'm going to go on the limb and say most Christians, okay, they wouldn't
So,
notice.
Rabbi, I think, so I would want to, I think I would like intrigued to hear what you, as a Jewish person, how do you look at this, right? Because to your point, this is we probably look at prophecy as in, to your point, it's offensive or trying to explain some of this. But back in the day, his audience were primarily Jewish, and they were steeped in the Torah and the scriptures. And if Matthew has it, so he tells me that to his audience, to who he was, that these prophecies mattered. Now, if you ask me, like living in the 21st century, do I really think about these prophecies day in and day out? No, not really, because my theology has been shaped by Paul and his view on Christ, right? But I can also imagine where back in the day that these prophecies were probably it's what meant that people viewed him as a Christ or viewed him as God. And so I was wondering if you could speak into like within the Jewish world, is the coming Messiah or his prophecy, right? Is that like how do people view that? Is it
So
something? Is it
I
something
com
so
right.
so
I
important?
completely agree with you that it's not as important. And I think for the first century Jews, it was very important. We mentioned several times that Isaiah, Psalms were some of the most important post-Pentateuchal books that were read by that community. And for them, it probably would have been a very, very important thing. For me, I agree it's not as important. That being said, Jews who do not believe the Messiah has come do have our own checklist. And that checklist is somewhat based on the Bible, but it's also based on the Talmud and the way that the Messiah is interpreted in the Talmud. And therefore, I think we do have a very different picture. And I think it's almost viewed as like gravy or something like, oh, that's great. It's prophesied in the Bible. I think the one place that it's been a little bit different in our generation is with Israel. Because I
Hmm.
think for the last 2,000 years, there's been no belief, definitely among the non-Jews, but definitely among Christians. There was never like this belief. Well, I don't want to say all Christians, but there's never a belief, I think, that Jews are really going to go back to Israel. I think that's more of a modern kind of thing in the Christian community. But in the Jewish community, there's always been a belief that Jews again will speak Hebrew. Jews again will collect from the four corners of the earth. And I'll tell you that Israel is viewed that when the majority of Jews live there, that'll be important. And right now it's something like 49.9% of Jews in the world live in Israel. So the fact when the majority of Jews live in Israel, that's definitely viewed as a messianic fulfillment of a biblical proportions in
So,
Judaism.
so are you saying that you? So are you saying? So it sounds like you're saying, in a sense, prophecy is not important, but you're saying the arc of Jewish faith or the arc of belief is also shaped by this prophetic belief, this prophetic expectation that at some point Jews will live in Israel. And so, could you
Well,
kind
I'd
of?
say it's important, like for again, just as important as you're saying. It's framed us. It's very important to see it. But if something went wrong, if something we see something isn't according to prophecy, I don't think anyone's gonna say, "Well, I don't believe in Judaism anymore." So I think we have like, or we'd say we have to reinterpret that verse. So I think there's this apologetic around prophecy fulfillments that when it works in your favor, you say yay, and when it doesn't work in your favor, you say that has to be reinterpreted. Jared is apologetic. Okay, well, today, very excitingly, we're going to be looking at one of the four servant songs in Isaiah. The servant songs were identified in the 19th century as being unique pieces in Isaiah. And we're going to be looking obviously at the suffering servant, the most famous of the servant songs in Isaiah. And I figured that for the purpose of seeing it with clarity, I thought it'd be helpful if you just read the whole servant song so we could not as much cherry pick as we always do to make a point, but let's try to see it in its wholeness. So it see it in its full wholeness, we should read Isaiah straight. To see it in its less wholeness, we should see at least the 4 songs. So we're still not seeing its wholeness, but at least we'll see the fourth of the 4 songs, which starts Isaiah 52:13. So if you could read first Matthew,
Mhm.
our verse from Matthew, and then can you read Isaiah? Okay.
Yeah, I will do. Thank you. The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 8, verse 16 onwards. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with the word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took he took up our infirmities and bore our diseases.
Right. So that's a little confusing, the English there, right? But
Mhm.
I assume when just we'll see it again, but he took our infirmities. We'll have to see what that even means, right? Like, what that mean physically took? I don't know. And bore our diseases.
Yeah.
So our first thing we also just have to take note of, it could have just said, "Your Messiah will cure the sick." This is definitely a poetic way to see it. So we're have to the whole servant song is a poem, so it's a little more complicated when you're interpreting poetry. But these are things that we're have to take note of. Okay, so with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Isaac, to read
Yeah,
Isaiah.
the book of Isaiah, chapter 52, verse 13 onwards. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. And so he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. The 50
Oh, just
verse,
keep going.
who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hid their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by pain and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear the iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong. Because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors.
Okay. Wow. So we never read such long verse by verse, but I feel that you can't get the whole picture without seeing this whole chapter plus. And I feel when Christians read this, they're like, check, check, check. This is the Jesus narrative. And I think what we have to be questioning if you want to have a Christological read to it, a Christian read to it, is it that these things were written by Isaiah, and then Christians made sure that this is how the narrative of Jesus was written? That would be the disbeliever. Or is it that this is the perfect prophecy? And I have a list here of New Testament quotations from Isaiah 53. I just want you to see how prevalent this is. So Isaiah 52:13 is cited by John 3:14, John 8:28. 52:15 is cited by Romans 15:21, Isaiah 53:1, Romans 10:16, John 12:38, Isaiah 53:4, Matthew 8:17, obviously, 53:5, 1 Peter 2:24, Isaiah 53:6, 1 Peter 2:25, Isaiah 53:7, Acts 8:32, Isaiah 53:9, 1 Peter 2:22, Isaiah 53:12, Luke 22:37. So we literally have 4, 5, 6, 7,
Quite a
11
few.
quotes, 11 citations in the New Testament, several of them from the from the synoptics. Notably, Mark is absent, and this is very important that Mark is absent. But what's interesting, it goes Isaiah 52, 13, 15, and 53, 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12. It's almost like a running commentary that Christians knew the suffering servant, the fourth of the servant songs, is so important that if we don't cite it, then we are misunderstanding Jesus, because this is our song. This is the song that Jesus is coming to fulfill. So, did you want to say something? I'm sorry.
Oh, no, no.
Okay.
So again, it's quite a few verses or quite a few references in the Old Testament to to the book of Isaiah. I think
Yeah.
before we go, right, I think I think I can see where to your point, they might have written all these verses to make sure that they check
Well,
out.
again, like I don't
And
want to
then,
give the disbeliever perspective, but we always have to worry about that. That shows up in multiple times in history where you cherry pick. But again, we just want to note that to start.
so it's a working assumption that if a prophecy, like the word of Isaiah, right, that he said something, and we've called it a prophecy, and which means that it has to be exactly like because it said there that it has to exactly follow that script like to the dot, right? Is that the working
Well,
assumption?
so you're noting a very important conundrum about prophecy fulfillment that no one knows the answer. And in Christian literature, there's actually two approaches. So one approach is that yes, the prophecy or the text that Isaiah said was applicable to the 6th century BCE, and we'll talk about different options of that a little bit later on. But even if it was applicable to the people who are then, it was double as another prophecy for a future. So it almost you get from one word, you get two separate incidences that will match up to it. And I think that's generally the Christian approach, that when Isaiah spoke these things, and I think it's a Jewish approach too, by the way, but when Isaiah spoke these things, it was meaningful to 6th century BCE Jewish people, but it's also meant to be eternally meaningful as a prophecy to future generations, and that is through prophecy fulfillment that is meaningful. Because if it was only about some guy living in the 6th century BC, it's hard to see how this would be so important. Okay, so before we go on, what I would like to do, number one, is I want to pull out general concepts just so we could see the Christian checklist. I thought that would be really, really good. So I have a list here. So let's start. So number one, we have I'm going to try to go in order of the song of the suffering servant. So number one, we see in 52:13, and it goes on all the way to the 53rd chapter. We see human opposition to God's purpose for the servant. The servant had a purpose in God's eyes, but people despised him and they considered him hated. Very easy to see how that is something. But what's interesting is that this is not like you would think the New Testament would parallel the suffering servant, but it doesn't. You really have to take Matthew or Mark or Luke out of order in order to get the suffering servant. The suffering servant starts as despised, and at least until right now, you can tell me if you feel differently. Jesus has only been shown love. There's been no there's been no hatred of him. If anything, if someone hated him at this point, I hate those beatitudes. Like you'd have to be a crazy person. So there's no hatred of Jesus. At least like I know there's different chronology in Matthew, but at least according to sorry Mark, at least according to Matthew so far, I have only seen positivity, and if anything, the negativity will be Pharisaic later on. Even the Pharisees are running with by John and him are running to hear him speak in the desert in different places. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, the suffering servant goes on. The servant's violent torture and death. That is something that is going to take place. Number three, we see in 51, the prophet questions whether anyone will believe him. If any, I just want to keep pointing out, like as of right now in Matthew, all the way to chapter 8, there's another, I don't know, I feel like we're halfway done in the chapters, right? How far does Matthew go?
Yeah, but there's no
Oh,
evidence that
third.
there's no evidence that again the instances where certain people believed him, right?
If, right.
As in certain individuals believed him, but there's still again but there's no evidence that the whole crowds believed him. But that again, to your point,
Wait, you said there's no evidence that the crowds believe them?
I mean crowds as in
The crowds,
if,
the crowds believe them. We
yeah.
we mentioned the crowds multiple times. Look, you could say it's not the whole crowd, but we definitely have mentioned crowds several times already, and the crowds seem to like him. Okay, but anyways, there's definitely no mention of that anyone's going to disbelieve him. Like there just doesn't feel that. Okay, three, number four, the servant is innocent. So we see in Isaiah 53:7, the servant is described as innocent of any retaliation. Number five, there's blessings upon his persecutors. So when the servant is suffering, his persecutors are given healing or peace or release from their guilt. Number six, the servant is shown to be correct or vindicated after he's dead, after his violent death. Number seven, that we see he gives righteousness to other people. The servant will make the many righteous. And last one, he gives forgiveness. Because of the servant's actions, the guilt of the many is removed from them, and they receive almost healing or a free of guilt pass. So the one thing I want to note, just is so interesting, is first of all, this is very like anyone who, again, I want to keep saying this, anyone who reads the suffering servant feels that definitely Jesus aligns with this. So I think we're going to talk about that. But Jesus doesn't align with this in the beginning. You got to read the whole New Testament to have a line. And if anything, it's really the suffering part. And it's interesting. I always think back if I was trying to create a Messiah, would I create one that goes through horrible pain and suffering? And if anything, it's an interesting model when you think about it. For example, the Jewish Messiah, there's different ways to look at it, but the Messiah, the son of David, is only a hero who conquers and changes, and the world is remade anew in a world where people see truth. You have no suffering. There's no idea. The only suffering you even find is this idea of Mashiach ben Yosef, the Josephite Messiah, who is viewed as almost like a prelude to the real Messiah. He has to die in order to get there, and that probably has to do with certain biblical interpretation. But the Messiah, the son of David, is generally viewed in Jewish tradition as not having this. Okay, so when Jews read that, and let's be honest, Isaiah was written, half a millennia before Christians came about. So they had 500 years of reading this and saying, I don't know. I don't know what it's talking about. So I want to give you some of the possible interpretations of who it is. So the main thing that people point out is that, is the suffering servant an individual or is it a people? Generally, Jews today will view the suffering servant as the people of Israel. How the people of Israel would have Jesus in the first century gone through these kind of tortures, but the actual Jewish people would be viewed as going through these kind of tortures as personified in either the Holocaust or pogroms or at various crusades. And then at the end of time, there will be this idea that everyone's forgiven, everyone kind of will see the truth of the matter. So at least one interpretation will be the Jewish people in general. But so let's go through it. Let's count on our finger. So number one, Christians will say Jesus. End of story. Number two, certain Jews will point out that it refers to the Jewish people in general. Number three, there's actually a Talmudic text in Shkalim 5:1 that points out that it could be Rabbi Akiva, the second century rabbi who died fighting for Judaism. Talmud Sota points out in 14a, maybe it could be Moses, the famous Moses. Sajgon, which is a ninth century rabbi, points out it might even be Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah. But some people point out last it could be just the Jewish Messiah. But when you look at it closely, we only read the fourth story, but there are elements that make it imply that it should be maybe a leper, because it says his appearance was so disfigured beyond the any of human being, and his form marred beyond a human likeness. So generally, people will say that Jesus was beat up so bad that he doesn't look like. But other people say that maybe that should be a leper, especially because it all says he was despised and rejected by mankind. Many of the suffering and familiar with his pain. So some people point out it's a leper. So we have 7 possible identifications, like historically, of this, aside from whatever person it could have been in the 6th century BCE. So what I just wanted to now, so that's, I think, the background of the suffering servant. So let's look back into the verse and try to figure out what the evangelist of Matthew was trying to make a point. And I'll give you first stab at it, Isaac. So this was to fulfill, what was to fulfill? The fact that he took away demons and he cured all the sick.
Mm-hmm.
This was to, or maybe just cured all the sick, unclear. So this was to fulfill that which spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took out our infirmities and bore our diseases. So Isaac, do you think this prophecy fulfillment makes sense based on what we are seeing in Matthew at this point? And why is
Yeah,
it? I'm all yours.
I think it's all contingent upon 8:16, right? Because the first place it says he drove out spirits and healed all the sick. The earlier 3 were instances of targeted healing of one person at a time. And this verse 16 is it points to a group of people, to a mass of people. I had to reread 53:4 again to understand the full context on this. Um, yeah, he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Now, I think again, 53:4 calls it pain and suffering, um, but Matthew calls it infirmities and diseases. That's a big difference between pain and suffering and infirmities and
Well,
diseases.
let me give you the Hebrew though, because obviously it's going to be, so the Hebrew word, it's 34. So again, it's a little more unclear. Achen chalayinu hu nasa machavenu. So, however, yet it was our chalayinu, generally viewed as our sickness. Hu nasa, that he raised up or he carried. Umacho venu, that just means like our wounds, right? Machavenu, our pain. Sevalam, he endured or bared. V'anachnu chashvanu nagul moko, and we considered him to be plagued or wounded by God. So that would be like, I think, a more literal translation, just giving you that. Okay. That's
Yeah. So again, that sounded like he was wounded by God, right? So again, all these nuances matter because here this speaks about infirmities and diseases, which is much more physical. Pain and suffering can be psychological. Again, pain and suffering in the context of Isaiah could be physical, but also psychological, right? So it's again, so I look at 53:4 as being comprehensive, but the book of Matthew is very particular on some of these physical ailments.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I'll give you some quick commentaries on this. So I'm just looking at Rashi because you mentioned Rashi before we started today. So what does Rashi say on this? He says, we thought that he was hated by God, but he was not so, but he was pained because of our transgressions and crushed because of our iniquities. So that's what Rashi says in this. There are other commentaries. So for example, we see the Ibn Ezra, another one. We have caused him grief, and has borne it. He has endured our sorrow, that is the sorrow which we have inflicted upon him, and we thought that he was stricken. So it's saying, he's adding, not that he was stricken,
We thought he was
but
stricken.
chashavnu, we considered him to be stricken and afflicted by God. That's how he is. So while we deserve to be afflicted with all this grief um, because our religion is false, it came instead upon Israel who follow the true. Okay, so that's how Ibn Ezra. Again, we could go through more commentaries, but we get a sense that this person is taking the brunt of the pain. What I find personally interesting is that when you compare this to, let's say, Mark, let's say 4:23 to 25, when Jesus went through the Galilee, teaching the synagogues and praying the good news and kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next verse, Mark 4:24 goes, so his fame spread throughout Syria, and it goes on, and they brought to him all the sick, all those afflicted with diseases, and he cured them all. But we don't get the verse here. So I mentioned that Mark doesn't have any of the verses from the suffering servant, and we'd have to wonder why does it not have it. And then when you look at Luke, which is also a close parallel, which is 440 to 441. Where is it? Okay. And as the sun was setting, all those who had were sick with various diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands and he healed all of them. He said, "Demons, come out! You're a son of God," etc. And they all came out. So he said, and it went on. So and it goes on in was it 6:18? They had come to hear him and to be healed of diseases, and those who were troubled, unclean spirits, and all the crowd were trying to touch him, and he healed. So we don't have the prophecy fulfillments. So it's unclear why Luke and Mark don't have it. One option is they don't have it because they're not trying to prove, like at least Mark is not trying to prove anything from Isaiah, and or they don't feel that prophecy fulfillment is important. Mark. Number two, if you take marking precedent, marking priority, then you'll see that Matthew added the verse because no matter what, you have to say the verse addition is the work of an editor, right? This is not necessarily part of the narrative. So it was added in order to show that Jesus is fulfilling stuff because this would have been more important to the Matthew community. You and I noted that it's not as important prophecy fulfillments today, but it could be for every single prophecy fulfillment that could have been stuck into Matthew that the editor could add would have been more very important for the community. And if anything, we should maybe wonder why Matthew doesn't have more suffering servants
Yeah.
verses. This is the only one that we have from Matthew.
Yeah,
Uh,
I was surprised having read through 53, 52, 53 for the first time today as a full unit. I'm surprised that they take out only this one verse, but not the other broader context from 52. If the goal was to show him within the context of of Isaiah 52 as in the suffering servant, this choice of 53:4, it doesn't look like a great
so Isaac, what's the reason?
doesn't look like a great choice.
No. Like, I want to point out, like, what do you think the reason? So we are the editor of Matthew, and we want to add as many Isaiah and or Old Testament prophecy fulfillments that we can to the New Testament because that is integral, important, and favored by the Matthew community. And yet, for the suffering servant, we only add this. And yet, in chapters, when we see Jesus suffering towards the end, we don't see this any verses from Isaiah. So, Isaac, what's the reason?
53:4 would not be my first choice. I think, but to your point, I don't know. I think there's so much more, right? I said,
Can I give you one reason, Isaac?
yeah,
I think you really like it.
yeah.
I think it's once I say it, you're gonna say it's obvious. The suffering servant is a story of pain and suffering, and that's horrible. The editor of Matthew literally found the one verse in the suffering servants that's super positive.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
He found the one verse. He says, I read this, a man of suffering, familiar of disease, hid his face, despised. Yet it was our sickness that he bore. That one line in 53:4 is super positive. And if anything, he actually cut the verse in half. Let's read the whole verse from 53:4. Yet it was our sickness that he was bearing, our suffering that he endured. And then the other half, we counted him plagued,
Punished by
smitten and
God.
inflicted by God. So he cherry picked one half of one verse from one of the four songs that could have been interpreted as being positive because Matthew doesn't want to talk bad about Old Testament prophecy fulfillments. He's trying to convince the community or represent the community to say positive things about Jesus. And while Jesus no doubt goes through suffering, the community didn't need to see more suffering being fulfilled as prophecy fulfillment. It could be they believed it because it's important and they experienced it or whatever. But that being a prophecy fulfillment would not have been meaningful for that community because they want to see awesomeness. They want to see greatness. They want to see relieving of suffering. And there's a ton of that. And the fact, if anything, we see at the end of the suffering servant narrative or poem, we see him healing. If anything, we should ask why there aren't more positive. But this is the most positive of anything. When I just scan it, we just see bad, bad, bad. He was maltreated. We all went away a street by oppressive.
Yeah, okay, so I would put this the other way around, right? So because this is prophecy, and he suffered, or if they frame the other verses, it's not that he suffered, but God made him suffer, right? Which then puts him on a much higher pedestal, versus in this case, right, 53:4, the focus is on him as look at his power, like he saved people. Because I would want to think, at least within the faith over there, that there is God, the one above. All the other verses speak of a sense of predestination as being foreordained, that you have to do this, that you will go through this, not because of what you did, but because of what the prophecy God laid out. So I'd want to think that four in that sense would be so weak, because it doesn't, like, there's nothing in this to say he did magnanimously, because all the others he speak about him, like 10, the Lord's will was to crush him, to cause him to be, well, that I can see where you can put him on a pedestal, because he's God's anointed chosen one to go through the suffering. I see a point that four is positive, but it's positive it comes across in a weak way, as in the focus
Oh
is
my
so.
God, the end of the verse is horrible. And again, like even there's a couple, I'm looking at the rest, there's a couple other that could be viewed as positive. If you look at, for example, two verses earlier, 52, which the second half is also bad. Um, for he has grown by God's favor like a tree crown, like a tree trunk out of arid ground. That sounds kind of like he kind of rose to the occasion. And he says he had no form of beauty that we should look at him, no charm. It gets bad again. So it almost like sent you. Okay, the point is that I think that this verse was cited because for the Matthew community, it was important to see positive prophecy fulfillments, even if they know that bad things happen to Jesus. Okay, Isaac. On that note, wow, we got through something servant. I think I'm happy that we finished our four healing narratives. I feel that these are integral for the modern Christian community to see Jesus' power and magical power to heal.
So
And
can I ask you, on the topic of prophecy, is the expectation that the prophecy you've said it has to be fulfilled in that exact way? Or is prophecy meant to be just to give a broad outline, right? As in, you
if he's
know,
a prophet, he should be able to say exactly what's going to happen, no?
so the prophet is Isaiah, right? So if something went wrong, it's not about Jesus, but Isaiah is about a prophecy. He's the one who made the prophecy. So so is the expectation that because Isaiah said this, that it has to happen exactly the way that he foretold?
I mean, like, it's so funny. Even like we didn't even talk about Deutero Isaiah, which is like from chapter 40 to 55. Most scholars see different Isaiahs in the book of Isaiah. And as I mentioned, they see the four servants stories, four servant songs, and possibly a fifth servant song later on. So we're not here to deconstruct how the book of Isaiah was formed, but I'll say taking it from a theological perspective, I think most
Mhm.
people expect that if a prophet is a prophet of God, and God is somehow atemporal and has access to all of human history, if God wants, God can tell you that a piece of dust is going to fall in 80 years on that exact spot, and there should be no problem with that. So that being said, I think that there is a leeway in that the text is kind of dead. The text exists and we interpret it. So we do with what we want. And therefore, when we could find things that buttress our belief, I think that is one of the things that the the reason that it exists
Yeah.
to
So
have this.
so be a good Christian, I have to ask this question, right? So what makes a prophet a prophet? How do you know? How do you know that he's a prophet? Is it just because they have a record of saying things, is having got a few things correct?
Well,
Is
I
it?
think the better question for you is not what makes a prophet, but what makes a holy book holy. Because what makes a prophet, it doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
Let's imagine there's a million prophets who have come and gone that didn't leave holy books. To evaluate just and we also did talk about what makes a prophet earlier. We talked about the tests that we have for
Mhm, yeah. Mhm.
but at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter that if these people were holy or prophets, right? What matters is that our community says they were, right? Our community looks at Isaiah or Deuter Isaiah or these songs and says that God wants us to keep learning these in perpetuity because they're eternally meaningful for every generation. So that idea is so important that we view this. And I'll tell you, I wasn't going to go into this, but I'll tell you like a little sidebar that in the first and second century, there were questions about which certain books, if they should be in the canon. The most famous example is Song of Songs, cantillations, that in the Mishnah in Yadayim, it has an argument saying that one, Rebbe Kiva thought that obviously it should be part of the canon, but other people thought maybe it shouldn't. And obviously Ecclesiastes, which I view as one of my favorite books, but definitely I view it should be heretical according to many people's beliefs about Judaism and or Christianity. So that book was thought to be meganez, to be hidden and put away. On top of that, the book of Esther, there was a conversation if it is just a story that was written historically or not, or if it was written with the Holy Spirit. And then we get a difference, like maybe there's a difference between the Holy Spirit versus prophecy. So there's a lot of questions. When a prophet writes a book, shouldn't it matter that what level prophet that prophet is? Like I feel like what happens if Matthew was a greater writer and or prophet than Luke? So does that mean that Matthew would have a greater insight, or is it that God is just pulling the strings? He'll make sure all the books he knew they're going to work out together and work out because we actually not only is there parallels between obviously overlap between Luke and Matthew, but you have the same thing in the Tanakh. You have overlap between Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and then you have a tremendous overlap between Kings and Chronicles, where you have the same stories told from different viewpoints, which is very much paralleling what's happening in Matthew and Luke, and a lesser degree Mark. So the question is, does it matter the level of prophet? Does it matter the level of prophecy that was? Is it just that all texts become text and become eternal once they're made part of the Bible? How did they? And as you know, Book of Maccabees, for example, is part of certain Catholic canons, and it's not part of the Jewish canon. So you even have a Jewish book that's not viewed as holy, that's viewed as holy by the church. So you have these questions that are hard to answer, and I think it's just more important the community that you're brought up and the belief you have. One of my favorite interpretations, and this is going to sound a little almost horrible, but I think what makes a book holy is that the community considers it holy. And
Hmm.
I know that's tautological, but there's no other, I feel there's no other way to interpret Judaism where you can have a vote. You have six guys in the first century said this was part of the Bible. You have three guys who said it wasn't part of the Bible, and now it's part of the Bible. So unless you want to say God's hand kind of made sure that that was the case, those three people literally didn't think it was part of the Bible. So they thought that book was not written by a prophet or by the Holy Spirit, and therefore it's not holy. So the fact that we say it is, it just means because a majority vote won on certain of these books. And if that's what you think a prophet means, that's like a really weak definition. So I view it very from a reductionist perspective that a holy book doesn't really necessarily tell you about the way it was written because we have no insight into that. It tells you about our community who says it was written by a prophet. And our community are not historians. Our community are as a community of believers, a community
Mhm.
of theologians. And our community is one that views it this way. And us viewing it that way is the most important thing. So it doesn't mean it was written or not written. It means that we believe it was written with prophecy. But our belief is not what writes history. History is independent of our belief system. So if someone, if like, we all die, we go to heaven and God says, what were you doing reading cantillations, Song of Songs? That was never holy. I'd be like, Rebbe Kiva said so. I don't know. Like I read it and it felt like I told my daughter, like, it's a little bit R-rated in certain places.
Yeah.
Like, so like I don't know. I was told it's holy, and my Talmud interprets the verses as holy, and I trust them. So by me saying that book is holy, it's just speaking about my trust and my belief in my community. And that's
Yeah.
why when certain communities of the church believe that Maccabees is holy, I say, great, go with it. I'm not, I wish you luck.
Rabbi, on that note, I think we
Yeah.
stand on shoulders of giants, and I think what he's saying is, so what he's saying is we are part of a continuum. The people have gone before us, and we've been shaped by that belief system, by the gifts they bring, and we build upon that. We grow from that. And it's not a group of historians. No, historians might be a part of it. It's primarily a group of believers and theologians.
Oh, man. Okay.
Amen. Well, Rabbi, on that note, thank you. Have a great day. Thank you.
Have a good day.